In 1978, what purported to be an anonymous letter, in very majestic 12 style, was mailed from Rapid City to the media in Florida. The envelope contained what appeared to be a carbon copy of an official US Air Force incident report, plus a brief, unsigned, typewritten note. The report was stamped for official use only at the bottom, and seemed, for all intents and purposes, to be real, and what it contained was shocking. The incident, as allegedly described by the commander of the Ellsworth Air Force Base's 44th Missile Security Squadron, described an alleged helping hand and covered wagon incident, aka a security violation, at the base, meant only for the eyes of Security Sergeant Paul Hinsman. It reads as follows. Helping hand security violation, covered wagon security violation, Site Lima 9, 68th SMSQ area, 7 miles southwest of Nisland SD. At 20:59 hours, 16 November 77, A1C Phillips, Samuel A. Lima, Security Control, telephoned WSC and reported an OZ alarm activation at L9, and that Lima Sat 1, A1C Jenkins and A1C Reiki were dispatched. Trip 62, ETA 21:35 hours. At 21:47 hours, A1C Phillips telephoned WSC and reported that the situation at L9 had been upgraded to a covered wagon, per request of Captain Stokes, Larry D., FSO. Security Option 2 was activated by WSC and Base CSC. Backup Security Force 1672 was formed. At 23:40 hours, 16 November 77, the following information was learned. Upon arrival at 21:32 hours at Site L9, Jenkins and Reiki dismounted the SAT vehicle to make a check of the site security fence. At this time, Reiki observed a bright light, shining vertically upwards from the rear of the fence line at L9. There was a small hill approximately 50 yards behind L9. Jenkins stayed with the SAT vehicle, and Reiki proceeded to the source of the light to investigate. As Reiki approached the crest of the hill, he observed an individual, dressed in a glowing green metallic uniform and wearing a helmet with visor. Reiki immediately challenged the individual. However, the individual refused to stop and kept walking toward the rear fence line of L9. Reiki aimed his M16 rifle at the intruder and ordered him to stop. The intruder turned towards Reiki and aimed an object at Reiki, which emitted a brief flash of intense light. The flash of light struck Reiki's M16 rifle, disintegrating the weapon and causing second and third degree burns to Reiki's hands. Reiki immediately took cover and concealment and radioed the situation to Jenkins, who in turn radioed a 1013 distress to Lima Control. Jenkins responded to Reiki's position and carried Reiki back to the SAT vehicle. Jenkins then returned to the rear fence line to stand guard. Jenkins observed two intruders, dressed in the same uniforms, walk through the rear fence line of L9. Jenkins challenged the two individuals, but they refused to stop. Jenkins aimed and fired 2 rounds from his M16 rifle. 1 bullet struck one intruder in the back, and 1 bullet struck the other intruder in the helmet. Both intruders fell to the ground. However, approximately 15 seconds later, they both returned to an upright position, and fired several flashes of light at Jenkins. Jenkins took cover, and the light missed him. The 2 intruders returned to the east side of the hill and disappeared. Jenkins followed the 2 and observed them go into a saucer-shaped object, approximately 30 inches and 20 inches thick. The object emitted a glowing greenish light. Once the intruders were inside, the object climbed vertically upward and disappeared over the western horizon. BAF-1 arrived at the site at 23:30 hours and set up a security perimeter. Site survey teams arrived at the site at 1:20 hours and took a radiation reading, which measured from 1.9 to 2.9 roentgens. Missile maintenance examined the missile and warhead and found the nuclear component missing from the warhead. Colonel Spraker, wing commander, arrived at the site and declared the site a national defence area and ordered all non-essential personnel out of the area. All evidence found at the scene in the follow-up report will be classified by order of Colonel Spraker. Reiki was treated at base hospital by MAD Captain Sanders for second and third degree radiation burns to each hand. Reiki was air evac to a specified location. Reiki's M16 rifle could not be located at the site. So amazing, right? A literal gunfight with aliens, or rather laser fight, who shoot disintegrating beam weapons, injure a soldier, then run away with the components of a warhead. Crazy, right? And if not aliens, then definitely some kind of Soviet or foreign spies and some kind of exotic craft. However, there was no exotic craft, or aliens, or Soviets, because the whole thing was a hoax. Bob Pratt, then a journalist down in Florida, as well as a member of MUFON, was naturally very curious about the incident. It was hard to get information, especially since the unsigned note alleged it came from an anonymous source. But he did try, and at first the results seemed amazing. Although he didn't expect it a hoax, Bob made a number of calls to the Ellsworth Air Base in Rapid City, and, to his surprise, everyone named in the report actually did exist. And interestingly, they couldn't reach Reiki. The phone number given to him by the base locator simply didn't answer, as if it had been disconnected. This, given the story of his alleged alien KGB laser burns, made him change his tune and believe there might be something to it after all. And so he, fellow journalist Bill Dick and fellow reporter Tony Brenner flew off to Rapid City to investigate. From the moment they arrived in town, they tried to reach Jenkins and Reiki by phone, and finally got through to Jenkins late on Saturday afternoon. Not mentioning anything about UFOs, they tried in vague, friendly terms to persuade him to come into town and talk to them. However, he was extremely suspicious and refused, further heightening their interest, and further making them believe there must be some kind of cover-up. Sergeant Hinsman and Captain Stokes, however, lived in the city, and Bob went to Hinsman's house, and Brenner to see Stokes. Hinsman was polite and courteous, inviting the reporter in, and this is when the reporter began to smell a rat, and not a glowing green one. When Hinsman heard the report, he reacted with interest and genuine surprise, wondering why on Earth, or Mars, or Zeta Reticuli, he'd never even heard about the incident before. Bob wasn't born yesterday, obviously. He knew better than to just take someone's word for it, but he took Hinsman's word, because Hinsman, via his extensive military experience, pointed out all kinds of inconsistencies. For example, he was not a communications plotter for Wing Security Council, but had a job connected with missile maintenance. He also said that Sergeant Stewart's first name was Roderick, not Robert, and that Captain Stokes was not a flight security officer at all, but was in charge of the flight security officers for all the missile flights under Ellsworth's command. Across town, corroborating this, Brenner was hearing the same thing with Stokes, who also said he'd been in hospital on the date in question. Stokes phoned the base to inquire about the incident, and a short while later, before Brenner left Stokes' home, Brenner received a phone call from the security headquarters at the base. He was asked to stop questioning Air Force personnel off base, and told that if he wanted to discuss the matter, they were welcome to come to security headquarters on Monday. Brenner agreed, and that afternoon, a third reporter, Eric Mishara, flew in from another assignment in California to join them. He rented a four-wheel drive, and while this was going on, spent most of the week interviewing ranchers and others in the neighbourhood of the Lima 9, and none of them knew about the incident. Meanwhile, Bob, Bill Dick and Tony Brenner went to Ellsworth, but instead of talking with security officials, they were rerouted to the office of Major Arthur Jungwirth, information officer for the base. For many people, this and the suspicious phone call would have reignited suspicions of a cover-up, but the alleged anonymous document began to further fall apart. Over the next 5 days, the information officer arranged for them to interview in his office all kinds of key people named in the report, including Reiki, who hadn't been missing or covered up, but had simply been out in the field for a number of days when they tried to reach him by phone. Furthermore, Ellsworth commands Lima and 14 other missile sites, consisting of 10 miles each, all scattered across 13,500 square miles of western South Dakota. Security policemen like Reiki and Jenkins spend a minimum of 72 hours in the field, and often more when winter snow closed the roads, and apparently had never even met each other. Jungwirth then provided the men copies of security police desk blotters from both Lima Launch Control Facility and Wing Security Control, which were minute-by-minute logs of all activities on November 16 and 17. Everything was routine. He also sent them copies of medical records, showing Captain Stokes was admitted and discharged. Furthermore, they contacted Reiki, who immediately came to Jungsworth's office and answered more questions in person, even rolling up his sleeves and showing off his hands and arms. No injuries. The reporters also managed to get a good look at Lima 9. Contrary to what the report said, there was no hill behind it. Not at all, and no way anyone could take cover from someone wanting to shoot at them, let alone shoot an alien KGB green laser. The final nail in the disc-shaped, green-glowing coffin was Brenner obtaining a copy of a high school yearbook, verifying that Reiki was indeed Reiki, and also checking with the director of a funeral home, who told them that Reiki was indeed home on November 16, attending his grandfather's funeral. Overall, they found more than 20 discrepancies or errors in the report. Wrong names, identity numbers, occupations, physical layouts, and so on. Had the security option alert maintained in the report taken place, it would have involved all security personnel at the base, would have spread like wildfire, and everyone at the base in Rapid City would have known about it. You could just say, the Air Force falsified documents, but that they've falsified numerous documents, muzzle everyone on the base and in the city, publish a phony high school yearbook and make everyone's testimony a lie? Unlikely. In addition, this operation, anonymous letter, bears all the hallmarks of a classic military disinformation operation. Remember the Majestic 12 documents? In the 80s, anonymously mailed to a number of journalists, were a number of documents alleging that President Truman, in 1947, had set up a top-secret UFO study group after the Roswell crash to manage and conceal the evidence. They were mailed on 16mm film to journalists, had all the right seals and stamps, seemed genuine, but then it emerged they were typed on a typewriter not used back then, there were identical signatures, a place where a corner of a signature had been whited out, and then we get the link to Bill Moore, who also links to Rick Doty. Back in the 80s, Moore was a prestigious UFO researcher who had written a book with Stanton Friedman called Crash at Corona about the Roswell incident. However, he was becoming frustrated. He couldn't find any conclusive proof of a government cover-up, and he started talking to people about how he wanted to fake documents that would then get real documents released, something called positive disinformation. And then Rick Doty comes into the picture. Doty promises Moore that he will get genuine UFO documents if he helps him out with the little matter of Paul Bennewitz. Outside Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico lived Paul Bennewitz, a scientist who actually had a contract to supply submarine parts to the US government. However, Paul began to photograph a number of strange lights lifting up from the base, sometimes with what looked like humans standing around them and flying across the hills. Paul at this point had no idea what he had, but he contacted the base and the Air Force, and they led him to believe that aliens were involved, that these were extraterrestrial craft, that they were nefarious, and they soon led him to an area called Dulce, New Mexico, and even actually flew him across Arcolata Mesa, the mountain there. There he photographed strange military movements, strange tanks and vats up there, strange things that looked like buildings, and came to believe that there was a secret UFO base down there, the aliens were implanting and abducting people, and that humanity was in danger. Paul eventually had a nervous breakdown, had to be admitted to a loony bin, and it later emerged that Rick Doty had got Bill Moore to help supply Paul Bennewitz with disinformation to drive him insane. They'd positioned props and things all over the mountain to make it look like there was real alien and human military activity. Dr. J. Allen Hynek had supplied Paul with a computer whereby he received fake alleged images of aliens. He was allegedly communicating with the aliens via code that was actually being beamed to him via this computer. And Bill Moore was helping out because Paul had allegedly stumbled across a top secret drone program that couldn't be unveiled. So we have, exactly in the same way as documents were sent in Italy anonymously alleging there was a UFO crash at Magenta, in exactly the same way as documents were sent anonymously about the Roswell crash, which are very definitely likely to be fakes, we suddenly have this alleged alien shootout at Ellsworth UFO base, and it bears all the hallmarks of a military disinformation operation. It even comes from the Air Force. And there are also allegations that Rick Doty was working at Ellsworth UFO Air Force Base at the time. Rick Doty being the infamous disinformation agent who drove Paul Bennewitz insane and has allegedly worked on all kinds of other operations. For example, there was an allegation that there was a Project Serpo, that humans were secretly travelling to an alien planet and aliens were travelling to the human planet so they could learn about each other, and the government covered it up. There was an alleged train of emails proving it, and the emails, according to a group of researchers, were traced back to Rick Doty's computer. Furthermore, Rick has even claimed in multiple interviews that they would do things like dress people up as aliens, send them into people's houses, fake alien encounters to distract people from real things linked to the military. And in addition, online, there are interviews where Rick Doty talks about alleged military encounters with aliens, and he talks about 2 aliens that landed and had some kind of glowing tube-like device, and it sounds very, very similar to this. Give it a listen.
The creatures were described as 4 foot tall, thin appearance, wearing a helmet, with a long tube connected to a tank on their back. The creatures had arms and legs. The creatures moved their arms in several different motions, apparently trying to communicate with the technicians. What the technicians said was they were trying to make hand signals, moving their hands back and forth. The technicians spoke English to the creatures. The creatures didn't seem to understand the technicians. One of the technicians spoke Spanish, but the creatures, again, didn't understand the language and didn't respond. One of the creatures produced a long cylinder from its suit. The creature moved towards the technicians with the cylinder, attempting, the technicians thought, to give this cylinder to the technicians. Fearing that the object might be radioactive or a weapon, the technicians refused to accept the cylinder. One of the creatures made a hand motion indicating for the technicians to enter the craft, motioning towards the craft in a gesture that the technicians thought meant for them to walk inside the craft. At this point, the technicians radioed to the command center to send help to their location. 2 Air Force military policemen arrived, both carrying a handgun and rifle. The standard weapons worn by Air Force security police personnel or military police was a .38 revolver, 6-shot, and an M16 rifle, which contained a magazine with normally 20 rounds in it. And what the military policemen were trying to do was challenge the creatures, which would be typical of military police. Identify yourself, keep your hands in the air, things like that. But the creatures didn't seem to understand anything that the MPs were doing or saying. One of the creatures walked to the senior MP and attempted to grab his arm. The MP pulled away aggressively. This appeared to scare the creatures. Now, you have to put yourself in the military policeman's shoes. These creatures weren't human looking. This happened in a very classified area. These MPs are highly trained to protect Air Force resources, especially top secret resources. So they were on their probably highest state of alert. And these creatures, non-humans, couldn't understand anything that these military police were saying or trying to do. One of the MPs pointed his rifle, an M16 rifle, at the creature and motioned for it to come with him, moving the rifle in a manner which meant, "You come with me." The creature didn't understand. Both creatures then returned to their craft. Panel closed and the craft took off towards the southwest. The creatures left the cylinder on the ground. Now, here we are in a situation where there was a confrontation between U.S. military personnel and extraterrestrials. We didn't know, or the military personnel didn't know the intentions of these extraterrestrials. You got to understand that these military personnel, even though they're highly trained, probably were extremely scared too. They were confronting something that they've never seen before. They didn't know what the creature's intentions were. Were they hostile? Why did they land in a top secret facility? And as one of the military policemen told us later, his first impression was, could these really be Russian personnel or Soviet deep cover operatives flying in some strange craft into a top secret facility to attack it, to steal something, or just obtain intelligence? Now, I know that's kind of out there for some people to believe, but you understand that if you're put in a situation like the military policemen were put into, all sorts of things probably ran through your mind. And what their main concern at this point was the cylinder that was left on the ground. There's no way that the military policemen could have detained these two creatures. They tried. They tried to have them come with them, but the creatures didn't. They returned to their craft, and while they were returning to the craft, the military policemen didn't attempt to stop them. They didn't fire any shots, but the creatures got in the craft and left. But again, they left that cylinder on the ground. Now, there's all sorts of things that went through the military policemen's minds. What was this cylinder? Was it a weapon? Was it an explosive? Was it some kind of ray gun? The two MPs went to the command post, informed the commander on duty, a captain, of what happened. And so they immediately then, the command post personnel immediately notified the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. The closest OSI office during that time period would have been Kirtland Air Force Base, some 2 hours away. So eventually OSI agents responded to Stallion Range. The two MPs and the two technicians were interviewed separately. All found the men's reports to be accurate as far as truthfulness. The senior MP reported that when the UFO took off, he noticed that the cylinder left behind glowed. When a voice was spoken in close proximity to the device, the center, or the crystal portion, glowed. Scientists then reasoned the device was a universal translator. Now you think back to what happened at Stallion Range near this top secret facility. These extraterrestrials pulled out this cylinder, pointed it towards the technicians, and wanting the technicians to speak into it in order for that device to translate English into whatever language the ETs were speaking.
So overall, the Ellsworth UFO hoax is fascinating because it shows just the extent to which the military, the intelligence, and the government has infiltrated UFO circles, all in the name of perverting the cause of justice, and all in the name of keeping us in the dark. Which is really quite despicable. You know, you don't need to drive people loony, you don't need to fake news, you don't need to fake documents. But what do you guys think? Were you involved in the Ellsworth incident? Were you involved in the hoax? Did you live in the area at the time and hear anything about this disinformation operation? Please leave your comments in the comment section below and stay tuned for the next podcast.